Tomorrow, a Today exclusive. After the...
This is an NBC News special report. Here's Tom Llamas.
Hey, good evening. We are coming on the air with breaking news. Moments ago, our NBC News reporters and producers in Ukraine reported hearing blasts in the region, a possible sign of conflict from Russian forces spread along the border there. This as the UN Security Council held an emergency late-night meeting during which officials implored Vladimir Putin to stop any hostile action towards Ukraine. U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, calling this a perilous moment, asking Russia's president to order tanks and planes and troops to back away from Ukraine's borders. A full-scale invasion could lead to one of the biggest conflicts we've seen in Europe in decades. U.S. intel warns that as many as 50,000 civilians could be killed or injured. President Biden has warned of a decisive response with swift and severe economic costs. So we are watching what's happening in Kyiv at this moment right now. You can see there's still a little bit of traffic there. It is roughly 5:29 a.m. in Kyiv. Again, our reporters and producers there in the capital city hearing what they think are explosions. Vladimir Putin taking to state TV tonight, the morning over there in Russia, announcing that U.S. imperialism, as he called it, is trying to spread its power and that NATO is threatening Russia, that they no longer have any more opportunity. I'm understanding we have our chief White House correspondent, Peter Alexander, who's been in contact with his sources and the White House with some of the messaging and some of the statements from President Biden tonight. Peter, what can you tell us from the White House, and what is their understanding of what's happening in Ukraine at this hour?
Well, Tom, I can tell you I've been inside the White House, and some of the president's top advisors I've already seen tonight. The National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, his chief of staff, and others who have been gathering and huddling over the course of the last several hours. And within the last 2 minutes, we have now received our first statement from the President of the United States. And since we just got it, I'll read some of the key portions of it. He says the prayers of the entire world are with the people of Ukraine tonight as they suffer what he calls an unprovoked and unjustified attack by Russian military forces. The president says that President Putin has chosen a premeditated war that will bring a catastrophic loss of life and human suffering. Russia alone, he says, is responsible for the death and destruction this attack will bring, and the United States and its allies and partners will respond in a united and decisive way. He writes, the world will hold Russia accountable. The president says in a statement, again, just released by the White House within the last 2 minutes, that he's going to be monitoring the situation from the White House this evening, and will continue to get regular updates from his national security team. Again, I ran into his national security advisor here in the White House within the last hour or so as he and others were huddling together based on the information that they are learning about what's happening on the ground in Ukraine right now. The president, as was previously scheduled, is announcing that he will be meeting tomorrow morning in a secure virtual call with the leaders of the G7, including the leaders of France, the leaders of the UK, and Germany as well, and then he will be delivering a statement later in the day. So we will look forward to hearing the president not tonight but tomorrow when he comes before the cameras and the world, after having a chance to gather together and consult some of America's allies. Tom, late tonight we also saw an emergency meeting of the United Nations Security Council where one of the individuals the president has been consulting with, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, told those gathered there that a full-scale invasion of Ukraine is imminent. She says there is no middle ground. Russia is the aggressor. Again, those are some of the details we're just learning from here at the White House. The president monitoring the situation overseas right now, as you've been reporting, as we've been seeing the first sounds of blasts taking place in Kyiv and other reports of other similar blasts happening elsewhere in that country.
And Peter, as possibly the first rounds in this war are fired, there's also a war of words happening between Vladimir Putin and President Biden. Vladimir Putin taking to state TV just a short time ago. Among the things he said, the spin he's saying really, and sort of changing the narrative here, saying the U.S. does not want to negotiate with Russia. And Peter, we know because we've been talking about this for weeks now, the U.S. has tried time and time again, along with the French, along with the Germans, to try to reach some kind of diplomatic consensus here to prevent this war from happening. Even this week, our Secretary of State was set to meet with the foreign minister of Russia, and President Biden said he was open in principle to meeting with Vladimir Putin, but now it seems like that diplomatic window has been shut.
Well, it's pretty clear that that window, if not locked shut for now, is shut for the near future. The U.S. and the president has said that diplomacy remains an option if President Putin is looking for an off-ramp. It was literally tomorrow, or I guess it's still tomorrow, Thursday, where Secretary of State Tony Blinken was scheduled to meet with his counterpart from Russia, Sergei Lavrov. They said that it didn't make sense to go ahead with that meeting. That meant as well that the president's meeting with Vladimir Putin that they had agreed to in principle wouldn't be happening as well. The president, as you know, laid out that first tranche of sanctions that hit a pair of state-owned banks, sanctions on Russian debt, meaning they could no longer raise money in the U.S. or from the U.S. and from Europe, and also on some Russian oligarchs. As it relates to those banks, as it was described to us by one senior official here, those were effectively the piggy banks for Vladimir Putin's, some of his closest friends, for Russia itself. And the president, most importantly, said that if Russia continued to escalate, the U.S. would further escalate these sanctions at the time. So we wait to see what that next step will look like at this moment. But again, recognize what we're witnessing right here, Tom. This is something that the U.S. has been warning about in what was an unprecedented fashion. They've been detailing exactly what they thought would happen, these pretexts, these sort of false, these lies to sort of give them the pretext to initiate this invasion would precede an actual attack, and that's exactly what we continue to be witnessing at this time. Again, the president monitoring the situation. I keep checking my phone for any other details as we're speaking to sources here about the circumstances, but this appears to be the opening salvos in what the White House fears could be a much larger war there.
Yeah, and it seems, at least for right now, this is not the shock and awe maybe some people were expecting, at least at this moment. Again, we want to couch all our reporting here. Our reporters and producers in Kyiv had heard some explosions. We are still awaiting confirmation on all of that. As you know, this is a very fluid situation, what's happening in Ukraine. What we do know is that there are 150,000 to 190,000 troops, when you consider some of the separatist forces as well, right there on Ukraine's border. Some of those troops may possibly already be in Ukraine territory if Russia indeed is moving forward. Peter, I want to talk to you a little bit about the map. If we talk about Europe and we talk about NATO, because one of the things Vladimir Putin is telling his people tonight is that NATO is trying to push their border. And from what we know, from what the Germans have said, from what the French have said, right? They said Ukraine, it is not on the agenda right now. It could be 6 to 10 years before the discussion for Ukraine to even join NATO gets to the point where they hold a vote. When we look at this map, Peter, you can see Russia right there, Ukraine, Moldova and Belarus aligned with Russia, but if Russia takes Ukraine, they are the ones that are threatening the NATO border now, with Poland, Romania, Slovakia, all those other countries right there on the border of Ukraine. And it is Russia now that is stepping on the toes of the rest of Europe. I understand now we have our chief foreign correspondent, Richard Engel, who has been literally reporting from the trenches in the eastern provinces of that country where the first salvos of this war may have already begun. Richard, what can you report for us tonight?
I've been up, which is about 15 minutes. I put one.
All right, this obviously, as we said, is a fluid situation. We'll come back to Peter. Peter, the point I was making earlier there is that if Russia does invade Ukraine completely, a full military invasion, it takes over the country, the capital is sacked. It is Russia then that is threatening, once again, the border of NATO. And this is one of the reasons why President Biden has reinforced troops all across those European countries.
You know, that's exactly right. As you communicated, it's why the president himself initially sent in several thousand more troops to help fortify, to bolster some of those NATO allies that border Ukraine and Russia there, most recently sending some troops already in Europe to some of the former Soviet republics, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and some others of Poland that you see there on the screen right now. I want to get back to where you started this conversation on Vladimir Putin and the statement that he made tonight. A couple observations on that. Recognize that it's the middle of the night or early morning hours there before dawn in Ukraine and in Moscow, and that we heard from Vladimir Putin announcing this special military operation to take place in the Donbass. That is the eastern portion of Ukraine, a wider area than the area that separatists already control, but the area that you see there, Donbass, right where the orange and yellow is on the right side, the eastern portion of Ukraine. But notably, the statement that Vladimir Putin delivered today, Tom, Tom. He was wearing the same clothing that he was seen wearing in that long, hour-long rambling statement we heard from him earlier this week. So a couple days ago, he made that initial statement, and in the same suit overnight, in the middle of the night Russian time, we saw this statement from him effectively declaring war, or at least this special military operation. So while we can't be certain, it does appear as if that may have been a pre-recorded statement from the Russian president, which is to say this was, as President Biden described it, a premeditated effort.
Yeah, it's interesting, that observation there, because they are very, very similar. I think we do have now our chief foreign correspondent, Richard Engel, who is in that region that Peter was just talking about. Richard, you have been literally reporting from the trenches. You got caught up in some minor combat earlier today. Tell us what you're seeing and what you're hearing.
Well, frankly, we're not hearing very much in the city of Mariupol. So there have been a few thuds, a few potential explosions, but in the distance, I'm on the balcony right now looking out onto the streets. There are some cars moving, some traffic, very few people out on the streets, but we are not seeing signs of a massive incursion or massive airstrikes at this stage. We've been bracing for this. We've been waiting for this potential day to come. Frankly, many people had thought that when it did start, there would be a huge cyber attack, that the lights would go off, that the phones would go off, that there could be potential airstrikes or severe airstrikes. But like I'm saying, in these very early hours, very first few minutes, we are not seeing that. We are just trying to understand the words of Vladimir Putin, what he means by this statement, how far they intend to go. Based on what we've been able to understand of his statements so far, it sounds like this is the start of a very severe campaign that goes beyond just the separatist areas. But here in these very, very early moments in the city of Mariupol, which is very likely in that area that Vladimir Putin is talking about extending into Russia's sphere of influence to give protection to these separatists, we're not seeing or hearing very much different at the moment.
Richard, it sounds every single day Vladimir Putin is trying to extend that goalpost a little bit more, piece by piece, trying to take Ukraine over. You had a chance to spend a lot of time with the Ukrainian troops where you are. They may be the frontline soldiers in all of this. What is their mindset tonight, this morning, as I should say, over there in Ukraine?
So their mindset has been bracing for the other shoe to drop. They have been fighting a low-level war against Ukrainian-backed separatists for 8 years. Now they've seen this massive military buildup that has taken place over the last several months. And then for the past several days, once Vladimir Putin recognized the autonomy of these self-declared republics and said that he would have to protect them as the Russian nation, and that it was Putin's duty to protect the Russian people, they have been bracing for exactly this moment. Some of the troops we were with today thought those early incursions and early airstrikes, I should say, from the some of the soldiers thought that the increased level of military activity coming from the separatists was the onset of a wider invasion. So they have been bracing for this, and they think that they thought it was going to start soon, but like I said, it's very difficult to know what exactly they are facing and what we're facing, since at this stage we've heard reports of just a few airstrikes in Kyiv, and not very much military activity right here.
It is quiet where you are. Richard, you and your team, please stay safe. I do want to go to Kyiv right now. We have about 2 minutes. I want to bring in our correspondent, Erin McLaughlin, who's there for us and heard some of those explosions earlier. You can see she's obviously taking the right precautions because it's still unclear what's happening in that capital city. Erin, what can you report?
Hey, Tom, well, we are getting some clarity from an advisor to the Minister of Interior Affairs on a WhatsApp chat to journalists saying that cruise and ballistic missile strikes are underway at the control centers in Kyiv. That is what he has written to journalists in a WhatsApp chat. In terms of what we are hearing, we've heard a number of explosions or booms here in Kyiv, the capital. I heard a rather large one to my left just a short while ago. At the moment, though, we are still getting electricity. There's still heat. We're still getting communications. I'm able to make a phone call. Right now, it's the early hours of the morning. the streets of the capital are empty. But again, people here are terrified. They have been staying up all night monitoring the situation. And there has been an element of disbelief up until this point that the Russians would go after the capital. But given what I'm hearing and what we're seeing in terms of from this advisor to the Minister of Interior saying that cruise and ballistic missile strikes are now underway in Kyiv.
Aaron, real quick, if you can, can you describe
yes,
real quick the explosions?
Well, they're loud. I mean, it sounded like a boom, essentially, and there have been a number of them. Again, the most recent one, I could hear to my left, and they were so incredibly loud. In some ways, you could also feel them. At least the last one.
Erin McLaughlin reporting from Kyiv tonight on those explosions she is hearing, and our team is hearing. That concludes our coverage for right now. We will have much more throughout the night on MSNBC, and of course, full coverage tomorrow on Today. I'm Tom Yamas, NBC News, New York.
Stalking her. He's following the line.